In this section, we're going to start talking about one of the last big complicated topics in Go. And so I'm really excited about this topic because I think that it's really going to kind of open the door for us to a lot of understanding about Go and how we design programs. So in this video and the next couple of videos, we're going to be talking about interfaces. Now, interfaces are a really key topic in the language. So we're going to make sure that we get a really good understanding of what they are and what they're doing for us. Now, I have looked at a lot of other Go tutorials out there, and I've noticed over time that it looks like a lot of those tutorials just kind of dive face first into interfaces and say, hey, here's what an interface is, here's the rules around them. But I've kind of noticed that when you take that approach, it's kind of challenging to figure out what interfaces are really doing for you as the developer. So we're going to take a slightly different approach here. We're going to first look at some of the code that we've been writing throughout this course. And I'm going to point out one really big issue with some of the code that we've been writing, and then we'll talk about how we can use interfaces to solve that big issue. Okay, so let's get to it. Okay, so kind of a reiteration on what we've been talking about so far, or at least two very important topics here. So first off, I want to remind you that you and I know at this point that every value that we declare in a Go program has to have a type assigned to it. Even if we don't explicitly define the type, even when we use that := syntax and let Go kind of figure out the type for us, every value still truly has a type. Now, the other important thing to remember is that every function that we have written is always specifying the type of its arguments or of its receiver, right? We've said, like for example, with our shuffle function back on the deck project, we had said, okay, here's the shuffle function. It has a type of deck. And we've seen examples of that throughout the course nonstop. Every function has a type. Now, if we kind of take this thinking right here to the very extreme end, you might start thinking, well, okay, does that mean that every function that you and I ever write is going to have to be rewritten to handle some different type, even if the logic inside the function is like identical in some fashion? So to kind of take this out to like the real extreme end or give you a very practical example of this, I want to remind you of the shuffle function from the deck project. So I already pulled it up on the screen. Here it is right here. Now, when we look at the shuffle function, I want you to look at the code inside of here, and I want to tell you if any of this code looks like it is specifically meant to work with a type deck. Like, is there anything here that has any reference to like a card or the fact that the deck holds a list of strings or anything like that? Well, I would argue probably not. All the code that I see inside of here, it really looks like this code is kind of not really caring whether it's working with a slice of type string or a deck or a slice of type int or a slice of type float or whatever else. However, you and I know that we always have to specify the type right here. So does that mean that for every different type we ever create, we're going to have to write out a different shuffle function? So like one shuffle function that takes a receiver of deck, another that takes a slice of float 64, another of string, and so on. Well, that would be really tiring really quick, right? Because we would just be writing out the same identical logic again and again and again, but the only difference would be the type that we are using as the receiver right here. And so clearly, this is not super ideal. We don't want to be writing out the same code over and over again if we can help it. We want to have some amount of code reuse. So this is in part, let me be clear on that, in part, one of the problems that interfaces is trying to solve for us. It makes it a little bit easier for us to reuse code between different parts of our code base. So with that in mind, I now want to talk a little bit about a little sample program that we're going to put together to get a better sense of interfaces and how they work. Now, this sample program that we're going to write is going to we're first going to write it out in a very naive approach, like kind of a bad way. And then we're going to refactor it to use interfaces. And that'll give us a much better idea of exactly how they work. So let's talk a little bit about this sample program. And we're going to first talk about the bad way that we're going to write it. So we're going to outline the program, we're going to write it the bad way, and then we'll come back and refactor it with interfaces. Okay, so here's the program. We're going to imagine that we are writing a tiny little program that creates two separate chat bots. So like a chat bot, something that you chat with, a computer you talk to, pretty much, that's all. So we're going to imagine that we have two separate bots. One is going to be an English chatbot, and then one is going to be a Spanish chatbot. So you can already imagine that an English chatbot and a Spanish chatbot, they're probably going to have a lot of similar functionality, but there might be a couple differences when it comes to handling specific types of language, or English versus Spanish, that kind of stuff. So we're going to imagine that both of these bots have a function that takes its respective type as a receiver, and the function's name is getGreeting. In both cases, this getGreeting function returns a string in the respective language. So in other words, getGreeting right here, I would probably expect its implementation to be very simple, very straightforward. getGreeting is probably going to have some code that says something like return hello there. And then the getGreeting for the Spanish bot is probably going to have something that says return hola, which is hello in Spanish. Now both bots are also going to have a function tied to them called print greeting. So on both sides, print greeting. Now you'll notice that the only difference between this function right here is the type that it expects to be called with. So on the English bot, the print greeting function expects an argument of type English bot, and over here it expects an argument of type Spanish bot. Now the code inside of this thing, inside both of these functions, is going to be equally pretty straightforward. Print greeting literally is supposed to just print out a greeting to the user. So I kind of expect the code of this thing to look a little bit like println eb.getGreeting. So that's kind of what I would expect this implementation to actually look like. So eb is short for English bot, and then it calls the getGreeting function, which returns the appropriate greeting string, either hello there, or in the case of the Spanish bot, hola. And so in both cases, we're talking about some pretty straightforward implementation, pretty straightforward functionality here. So one thing I want to point out here about these two different types of bots we're putting together, if we think about these two different functions, getGreeting and print greeting, well, in the case of getGreeting, we're pretty clearly saying that the code inside of both of these functions is going to be very dissimilar, right? Like the English bot for getting a greeting over here, this is going to contain some code that generates a greeting specifically in English. And so we're probably going to write some code in there that is 100% tailored specifically for working with an English bot. And then for the Spanish bot version, we're probably going to have very different code that specifically is saying generate a greeting for the Spanish bot version of this thing. Now, of course, you and I know that, well, the only difference here is the actual string we are returning between the two. This one is hello there, this one's hola. But for the sake of all discussion, I think you can agree that getGreeting between these two bots have very different implementations, right? Very different code inside them. However, the print greeting function in both cases seems like it's probably going to end up having very identical logic, like very, very similar. So like we just said, in both cases, print greeting on both of these is probably just going to call the println function, take whatever argument is passed to it, call the getGreeting function on it, and that's it. So between these two functions right here, these really do look very, very similar. Yes, the variable name is different, but at the end of the day, the code looks awfully similar to me. So when I look at these two different types that we've declared here, or that we are going to declare very shortly, I am very quickly getting the sense that the getGreeting function, both of them, contains some very custom logic, but the print greeting function for both of them contains some very general or generic logic. Like it definitely seems like it would be great to be able to reuse this print greeting function for both the English bot and the Spanish bot. Okay, so with that in mind, that's really just kind of the broad overview of the program that we're going to make. Let's take a quick break. We're going to come back in the next section and we're going to start putting this example together, making sure that we create a separate print greeting function for each bot. And then once we do that, we'll just kind of say, yep, these two functions look very similar. It would be great to not have to write out both different functions. And then we'll figure out how we will use interfaces to achieve that. So quick break and we'll start to tackle this project in the next section.